July 1945. The air inside the limestone caves of Okinawa is not merely air. It is a thick, gelatinous soup of salt spray, gangrene, and the copper tang of stagnant blood. Outside, the world is screaming under the weight of naval bombardments, but inside these jagged fissures, there is only the rhythmic, wet sound of condensation dripping onto limestone and the shallow, ragged breathing of the dying. Here, in the flickering amber glow of oil lamps made from discarded ration tins, the Japanese field nurses move like ghosts. Their uniforms, once a proud, starched white, are now stiffened with the brown crust of old gore and the yellow clay of the island. They work in a silence born of absolute exhaustion, their hands trembling as they apply the last of the clean bandages to shattered limbs. Each drip of water from the cave ceiling marks a second closer to the inevitable. For these women, the war has narrowed down to the diameter of a candle's flame. They are the guardians of a subterranean purgatory, waiting for the moment the flickering light finally goes out. In the shadows of the cave's deepest recesses, the nurses carry more than just medical supplies. They carry the heavy, jagged weight of a terrifying certainty. They have been told, since the first American boots hit the black sands of the beaches, that the men coming for them are not men at all. They have been steeped in a narrative of demonic cruelty, convinced that surrender is not a cessation of hostilities, but the beginning of an unthinkable desecration. To these nurses, the approaching rumble of American tanks is the footfalls of a monster. They have seen the propaganda posters and heard the frantic warnings of their officers. The Americans will show no mercy to the weak, and certainly none to the women of the empire. In their pockets, many of these nurses conceal small, sharpened scalpels or glass vials of cyanide. They are prepared to cut their own throats rather than fall into the hands of the blue-eyed devils, who are currently methodically burning their way across the ridges above. The sensory details of the cave are overwhelming. The smell of rot is so pervasive it has become a physical presence, a weight on the chest that makes every breath a struggle. The walls are slick with a moisture that never dries, and the floor is a treacherous mire of mud and discarded surgical dressings. Occasionally, the cave floor shudders, not from the earth moving, but from the concussive force of a 16-inch shell hitting the cliffs nearby. Dust falls from the ceiling, coating the open wounds of the soldiers in a fine, gray powder. Amidst this nightmare, the nurses operate with a mechanical, detached efficiency. They are beyond tears, beyond prayer, existing in a state of suspended animation where the only reality is the next bandage, the next cup of lukewarm water, and the looming shadow of the end. They do not expect to see the sun again. They expect only the darkness of the cave to eventually become the darkness of the grave, an honorable end in the service of an emperor who feels as distant as the stars. To understand the sheer weight of this terror, one must look back at the years of ideological hardening that preceded the Battle of Okinawa. Since the early 1930s, the Japanese educational and military systems had been meticulously re-engineered to view the Western powers not merely as geopolitical rivals, but as existential, predatory threats to the very soul of the Yamato race. By 1945, the Field Service Code, or Senjinkan, had become the ultimate moral compass for every soldier and civilian attached to the military. Its most famous decree, that one must never endure the shame of being held prisoner, was more than a suggestion. It was a spiritual law. For the nurses, many of whom were barely out of their teens and belonged to student corps like the Himuri, this meant their lives were already forfeit. They were taught that to be captured by the Americans was to enter a cycle of degradation that would strip them of their honor and their humanity. The historical reality of the Pacific War had reinforced this desperation. As the island-hopping campaign brought the Americans closer to the Japanese mainland, the imperial propaganda machine went into overdrive. Reports of heroic deaths on Saipan and Tinian were broadcast back home, framing mass suicide as the only virtuous response to the American advance. In the mind of a Japanese nurse in 1945, the American soldier was a caricature of savage industrial might, a man-monster who utilized flamethrowers and napalm with a callous indifference to life. They believed that the Americans fought not for ideals, but for the sheer joy of destruction. This indoctrination created a profound psychological barrier. It made the act of healing secondary to the act of preparing for death. The medical kits contained fewer medicines and more razors, as the final charge became the only treatment left for the wounded. This context of total war meant that every interaction was viewed through a lens of extreme hostility. The Japanese authorities knew that if their people realized the Americans were governed by a different set of ethics, the will to fight to the last person might crumble. Thus, the nurses were kept in a state of constant, vibrating fear. They were told that the Americans would use them for target practice or worse, ensuring that even the sight of a red cross on an American helmet was viewed with deep suspicion. This was the tragedy of the Pacific. Two cultures colliding with such force and such misinformation that the possibility of mercy was seen as a trap. The nurses in the caves were not just hiding from bombs. They were hiding from a lie so pervasive that it had become their only truth. As the sounds of heavy boots moved toward the cave entrance, they did not reach for their bandages. They reached for each other's hands, whispering final goodbyes in the suffocating dark. The light at the mouth of the cave did not arrive as a soft dawn, but as a violent, intrusive glare that cut through the stagnant gloom like a blade. It was the silhouette of a man, framed by the blinding intensity of the Pacific sun, his figure broad-shouldered and heavy with the gear of modern war. For the nurses huddled in the recess of the limestone, this was the moment of the great terror. They watched, breathless, as the metallic clatter of a Browning automatic rifle echoed against the damp walls. They expected the sudden, searing heat of a flamethrower or the hollow cough of a fragmentation grenade tossed into the dark. Their hands clutched the hidden scalpels in their pockets, fingers white-knuckled and trembling. In their minds, this soldier was the vanguard of an army of executioners, a giant who had come to finish the work the artillery had started. Every muscle was coiled for the final scream, every heart hammered against ribs that had known only the starvation of the caves for weeks. But the violence did not come. Instead, there was a strange, heavy silence, broken only by the crunch of heavy leather boots on the shattered rock. The Marine did not charge. He did not scream war cries. He stood at the threshold, his silhouette lowering as he adjusted to the darkness, peering into the shadows with an expression not of bloodlust, but of wary, profound exhaustion. Behind him, more shapes appeared. Men with rolled-up sleeves and helmets pushed back, their faces caked in the red dust of Okinawa. They moved with a disciplined caution that the nurses found incomprehensible. To the Japanese women, trained in the philosophy of the suicide charge, this measured approach felt like a psychological taunt. They waited for the inevitable rough handling, the shouting, the stripping of their dignity. Yet the Americans spoke in low, rhythmic tones, a language that sounded like the rolling of stones in a riverbed, devoid of the jagged edge of hatred they had been promised by their commanders. The contrast between expectation and reality began to manifest in the smallest of gestures. An American corpsman stepped forward, his hands held open and away from his sidearms. He did not look at the nurses as spoils of war or as enemies to be dispatched, but as obstacles to be navigated with a bizarrely clinical detachedness. When the first nurse was beckoned forward, she moved with the stiffness of a woman walking to the gallows, her eyes fixed on the ground, waiting for the first blow. It never landed. Instead, a large, calloused hand reached out, not to strike, but to steady her as she tripped over a discarded shell casing. The touch was firm and strangely indifferent to her status as a daughter of the Empire. This was the arrival of the giants, not as the demons of propaganda, but as tired, efficient men who seemed more interested in the logistics of the cave's evacuation than in the glory of the kill. The nurses, still clutching their hidden blades, felt a disorienting shift in the air. The script of their martyrdom was being ignored by the very men supposed to write it. The emergence from the cave was not a transition but a rebirth into a world that had become unrecognizable. As the nurses were led out, the physical sensation of the air changing, from the stagnant metallic rot of the subterranean hospital to the salt-tinged, expansive heat of the Okinawan coast, was jarring. They walked in a line, their heads bowed, expecting at any moment to hear the sharp crack of a rifle or the heavy thud of a boot. This was the surrender of the damned. To them, they were already dead. Their presence on the surface was merely a biological delay before the final execution. They passed rows of American equipment that stretched toward the horizon. Massive, olive-drab trucks, stacks of crates taller than houses, and thousands of men moving with an organized, terrifying energy. The scale of the American presence was a physical weight, a manifestation of an industrial power that their propaganda had claimed was soft and decadent, yet here it stood, monolithic and undeniable. As they reached a temporary processing area, the psychological tension reached a breaking point. One young nurse, her hands still stained with the fluids of the cave, dropped to her knees, offering her neck in a final desperate gesture of ritualized submission. She waited for the blade. Instead, she felt the weight of a heavy wool blanket draped over her shoulders. The Americans did not see a fanatical enemy to be purged. They saw a malnourished, traumatized civilian. Factual records of these encounters often note the profound silence of the Japanese captives, a silence born not of stoicism, but of a total cognitive collapse. The narrative they had lived by, that the Americans were subhuman monsters who delighted in torture, was being systematically dismantled by the simple, mundane reality of being handed a canteen of clean water. The water was not poisoned. It was cool, clear, and tasted of the world they thought they had lost forever. This was the beginning of the great unraveling. As they were moved toward the rear area medical stations, the nurses observed the American treatment of their own wounded. In the Imperial Japanese Army, a soldier who could no longer fight was often viewed as a burden, a shame to be discarded or cleared with a grenade. Yet, here, they saw American orderlies rushing to help men who were broken and screaming, treating their pain with a chemical abundance that seemed miraculous. The nurses watched as morphine was administered without hesitation, a stark contrast to their own caves where surgeries were performed with rusted saws and no anesthesia. The realization began to take hold. The Americans did not value life because they were weak, but because they had the immense, staggering wealth to afford it. Every bandage used, every drop of medicine given, was a silent indictment of the ideology that had sent these women into the caves to die for a lost cause. They were prisoners, yes, but for the first time in years, they were not expected to be martyrs. The nurses were transported to a sprawling military encampment behind the front lines, a city of canvas and steel that had risen from the volcanic soil in a matter of days. It was here, amidst the roar of generators and the constant transit of jeeps, that they encountered the ultimate symbol of their new reality, the field hospital cot. Inside the primary medical tent, the air was filtered and cooled by mechanical fans, a sharp, sterile contrast to the humid rot of the caves. Along the walls stood rows of folding cots, each topped with a thick wool blanket and a pair of pristine, bleached white bedsheets. To the Japanese women, the sight was surreal. In the imperial ideology, white was the color of death, of the funeral shroud, and of the ultimate sacrifice. Yet, as they looked at these sheets, they saw not a preparation for the grave, but an industrial-grade commitment to comfort. The fabric was heavy, clean, and carried the scent of strong lye soap, a fragrance of civilization that felt like an assault on their senses. This white fabric served as a silent ambassador for the American way of life. For years, the nurses had been conditioned to believe that resources were something to be hoarded, that every scrap of cloth and every ounce of medicine was a precious, dwindling commodity to be used only for the preservation of the state. The Americans, however, used these sheets with a casual, almost reckless abundance. They were swapped out as soon as they were soiled. They were stacked in mountainous piles outside the laundry tents. They were everywhere. To the nurses, This was the most profound form of psychological warfare. It was the physical manifestation of a nation that did not need to ask its people to die in caves because it possessed the logistical power to keep them clean and comfortable even in the heart of a war zone. The white bedsheet became a recurring motif of their captivity, a constant reminder that the enemy they had been taught to hate was possessed of a wealth that defied their understanding of the possible. The emotional impact of this abundance was deeply disorienting. The nurses stood in the center of the tent, their tattered uniforms making them look like charcoal sketches against the vivid, starched backdrop of the American medical ward. They watched as American orderlies moved with a brisk, unhurried pace, smoothing the sheets over empty cots. There was no ritual, no ceremony, and no sense of the sacred, just the mundane, repetitive labor of maintaining a standard of living that the Japanese elite could barely maintain in Tokyo. The nurses realized that the decadence they had been warned about was actually a terrifyingly efficient form of resilience. This was the diet of democracy, the belief that the individual soldier, or even the individual prisoner, was worth the effort of a clean bed. As they touched the fabric, feeling the coarse, reliable weave of the cotton, the first cracks in their loyalty to the imperial cause began to widen. They were being conquered not by the sword, but by the laundry list. The nurses stood frozen in the center of the tent, their eyes darting between the towering American medical officers and the rows of empty cots. The tension was a physical pressure, a vibration in the air that felt like it might shatter the fragile peace of the room at any moment. They were waiting for the command, the harsh, barked order to begin cleaning the floors, to serve the victors, or to prepare for the interrogation they were certain was coming. In the Imperial Japanese Army, a woman's role was defined by tireless service and self-obliteration. To be idle was to be useless, and to be useless was to be disposable. They kept their hands folded tightly in front of their soiled aprons, shoulders hunched, bracing for the inevitable work that would surely be the price of their lives. Then, a massive American sergeant, his face tanned and creased with the dust of the front lines, stepped forward. He did not point to a broom or a stack of laundry. Instead, he made a slow, heavy gesture toward the cots. He spoke a single word in English, his voice surprisingly soft for a man of his stature, but it was his body language that carried the weight of the instruction. He mimed the act of laying one's head upon a hand, closing his eyes for a brief, exaggerated second. He was telling them to sleep. He was telling them to rest. The nurses did not move. They looked at each other with wide, panicked eyes, certain that this was a trap or a cruel test of their loyalty. They had been awake for nearly 72 hours, fueled only by adrenaline and the terror of the caves, yet the concept of sanctioned rest in the presence of the enemy was a cognitive impossibility. The sergeant, sensing their paralyzing confusion, walked over to the nearest nurse, the young girl who had previously offered her neck for the sword. He gently took her by the elbow and guided her toward a cot. He did not push her, but the firm intent of the gesture was undeniable. As she sat on the edge of the bed, the sudden plush resistance of the mattress seemed to shock her system. For months, she had slept on jagged limestone or in the mud of the trenches, her body molded to the harshness of the earth. Now, the American pushed her back until her head hit the pillow, a real pillow, stuffed with feathers and encased in that same blindingly white cotton. The nurse let out a sharp, jagged gasp, her hands flying to her mouth. She waited for the laughter, the mockery, or the blow. But the sergeant simply turned away, moving to the next woman to repeat the gesture. This was the order to sleep, a command that broke the nurses more effectively than any bombardment could. One by one, they succumbed to the physical reality of the beds. As they lay back, the silence of the tent was filled only by the hum of the electric fans and the distant, muffled thud of artillery fire that now felt a lifetime away. They lay perfectly still, staring up at the green canvas ceiling, their hearts racing. They were being ordered to indulge in the ultimate luxury while their nation burned. It was an act of mercy so radical that it felt like an assault on their very identity. In the silence, the symbolic power of the white bedsheet took hold. It was a sanctuary of cloth, a boundary between the nightmare they had left and a future they could not yet imagine. For the first time since the war began, the nurses were not required to be soldiers or martyrs. They were simply humans, permitted to close their eyes. If the physical comfort of the beds had cracked the nurses' psychological defenses, it was the arrival of the food that shattered them completely. In the Imperial Japanese Army of 1945, the logistics of nutrition had devolved into a slow-motion catastrophe. Soldiers and medical staff on Okinawa had been subsisting on starvation rations, handfuls of dry, unpolished rice often stretched with sawdust or the bitter roots of the cycad palm. To these women, hunger was not a temporary sensation but a permanent state of being, a dull ache in the marrow that made their bones feel like glass. They had been taught that the Americans were soft because they indulged in luxury, but they were about to discover that this luxury was backed by a steel-cold industrial efficiency that ensured every captive was fed better than a Japanese general. A wooden tray was placed before each nurse, and as the steam hit their faces, the aroma was nearly hallucinogenic. It was not the meager, watery gruel of the caves. Instead, there were thick slices of white bread, so airy and soft they seemed like clouds captured in wheat. Beside it sat a mound of scrambled eggs, shimmering with a richness they hadn't seen in years, and a small, rectangular tin of meat, the ubiquitous spam that had become the fuel of the Allied advance. To the Japanese eye, used to the aesthetics of scarcity, this was a display of obscene wealth. They stared at the metal trays, their mouths watering with a painful intensity. Again, the fear of poison flickered in their minds, a final trick to eliminate the survivors, but as they watched a young GI nearby casually tear into a similar sandwich, the instinct for survival overrode the echoes of propaganda. The act of eating became a transformative experience. As the nurses tasted the salt and the fat of the American rations, the physical sensation triggered a profound emotional release. In the records of such encounters, witnesses often described Japanese prisoners breaking into uncontrollable tears while eating. It was the realization of the sheer scale of the lie they had been told. Their leaders had promised them that Japan was the land of the gods and the Americans were a dying, decadent race. Yet here was the evidence. A nation that could ship fresh eggs, white bread, and meat across 10,000 miles of ocean just to feed its prisoners. The food was not just sustenance. It was an ideological weapon. Every bite confirmed that the war was not just lost, but that it had been a conflict between a world of forced scarcity and a world of seemingly infinite abundance. Beyond the calories, there was the presence of small, unexpected luxuries, a square of dark chocolate and a single waxed paper packet of sugar. To the nurses, who had seen children die for lack of a single orange, these items were staggering. They handled the chocolate with a reverence usually reserved for religious icons, nibbling at the edges to make the sweetness last. This was the diet of democracy, a system that viewed the metabolic needs of the individual as a logistical priority. As the nurses finished their meals, their bodies finally beginning to warm from the inside out, the cognitive dissonance reached its peak. They were being kept alive by the very demons they had been prepared to kill themselves to avoid. The white bed sheets and the silver trays formed a new reality, one where their value was not measured by their willingness to die, but by their capacity to recover. As the nurses settled into the rhythm of the medical camp, a new and perhaps more unsettling realization began to dawn upon them. The Americans were treating the wounded Japanese soldiers with a level of care that bordered on the obsessive. This was the mirror of humanity, a phenomenon that forced the women to look at their own culture and their enemies through a lens they had never before possessed. They sat on the edges of their cots, watching through the mesh screens of the tent as American doctors, men who had every reason to harbor a deep, burning hatred for the soldiers of the Empire, labored over the broken bodies of their former adversaries. There was no distinction in the surgical theater. A Japanese corporal with a shattered pelvis received the same plasma, the same sterilized instruments, and the same intensity of focus as an American lieutenant from Ohio. This clinical impartiality was a direct assault on the Japanese military's core philosophy. In the imperial system, the wounded were often viewed through the grim calculus of utility. If a man could no longer hold a rifle, his value to the state evaporated, and he was frequently expected to perform one last duty by taking his own life. Yet, the Americans moved with a different logic. They were governed by a professional oath and a cultural surplus that allowed them to treat life as an end in itself. The nurses watched as an American surgeon, his brow glistening with sweat, spent 3 hours debriding the wounds of a Japanese prisoner. They saw the GIS gently shifting the positions of paralyzed Japanese men to prevent bedsores, using those same ubiquitous white sheets to pad their fractured limbs. It was a display of mercy that felt almost insulting in its generosity, a silent refutation of everything the nurses had been taught about Western barbarism. Through this mirror, the nurses began to see the reflection of their own indoctrination. They realized that their willingness to die in the caves had not been a product of superior courage, but of a catastrophic lack of imagination. They had been told that the world was a zero-sum game of survival and conquest, but the Americans were operating in a reality where the preservation of an enemy's life was a point of pride. This transformation was not instantaneous. It was a slow, agonizing erosion of their previous worldviews. Every time they saw an American medic check the pulse of a Japanese captive with a look of genuine concern, the ideological pillars of the empire crumbled further. They were discovering that the ultimate victory of the United States was not just found in the range of its bombers or the thickness of its armor, but in its ability to remain human while fighting a total war. The presence of the white bedsheets, now draped over the beds of both victor and vanquished, became a profound symbol of this shared humanity. Under the clean, industrial cotton, there was no difference between the skin of the Okinawa nurse and the American corpsman. The nurses began to understand that the abundance they had witnessed, the food, the beds, the medicine, was not just for the Americans. It was a standard they intended to apply to the world. In the quiet of the ward, watching the steady drip of 4 fluids into the veins of their countrymen, the nurses stopped looking for the scalpels in their pockets. They began, for the first time, to look at the hands of the Americans as the hands of healers. The mirror had shown them that the enemy was not a demon, but a man who had chosen to be a savior. By the end of the first week of captivity, the psychological landscape of the nurses had undergone a total transformation. The rigid, brittle certainty of the imperial cult had been dissolved by a persistent and methodical application of kindness. It was a dissolution of the lie so absolute that it left the women in a state of quiet, contemplative grief, not for their nation, but for the years they had spent fearing a shadow. They sat on their cots, their bodies finally beginning to fill out the hollows of starvation, and looked at the world with eyes that were no longer clouded by the fog of war. The propaganda had insisted that the Americans were a race of savages who lacked a spiritual core, yet every interaction in the medical camp suggested the opposite. They saw that the American strength did not come from a willingness to die, but from a profound, organized commitment to the living. The nurses began to reflect on the nature of the honor they had almost traded their lives for in the dark of the caves. They realized that the true barbarity was not found in the weapons of the enemy, but in a leadership that viewed its own daughters as sacrificial tools. The white bed-sheets, which they now helped to fold and stack as a gesture of gratitude rather than forced labor, became the physical evidence of this new understanding. They understood that the abundance of the West was not a sign of decadence, but the byproduct of a system that valued the individual. In the quiet moments of the evening, as the tropical breeze moved through the camp, the nurses spoke in low tones about the futures they had never allowed themselves to imagine. They realized that the surrender was not an end, but the first honest breath of their lives. This shift in perception was the ultimate victory of the American campaign on Okinawa. It was the moment the ideological war was won. The nurses, who had been prepared to be the last defenders of a dying empire, were now the first witnesses to a new era. They saw that the American soldier was not a demon, but a man who carried the resources of a continent and the ethics of a democracy in his kit bag. The realization that they were allowed to exist, to eat, and most importantly, to rest, was the catalyst that changed them from subjects of a god-king into citizens of a human world. The lie had been dismantled not by a superior argument, but by the undeniable reality of a clean bed and a warm meal. They were no longer afraid of the giants. They were simply waiting for the peace they now knew was possible.